Hey guys, Derek Checkis here with Team Align, and today I wanted to go over some things to pay attention to while assembling your T-Rex tail case. Particularly those of you who are running the Align dual point pitch lever assembly used in the newer DFC models. So we have a few items to go over today, including some assembly tips regarding the transmission case, the tail slider assembly itself, as well as the lever assembly, and a few other items too. But to start, I just want to go over some of the tools and adhesives that we'll be using during this video. So I have here a 4-way nut driver. We need a Phillips head screwdriver. This is a JIS style screwdriver, so this has the correct tip for the Align bolts that actually retain your tail grips to the dog bones that go on the pitch slider assembly, as well as our standard 3 metric hex drivers. I have the 1.5, the 2mm, and the 2.5mm. We have Loctite 609, which is a retaining compound used to retain bearings and shafts and the like. I have Loctite 243, which is your standard blue Loctite. We have some cotton swabs, some synthetic grease, and finally we have some isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle just to help with dispensing it. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. Okay guys, so the first thing I want to go over is the transmission case itself. One thing to pay attention to is the bearings that are in here that the bevel gear here actually rides in, as from time to time, through crashes or just wear over many hundreds of flights, the bearings can get notchy or worn out. The one in here actually feels pretty good, but the one in front here, when I checked it, had a little bit of notchiness, so I wound up removing it, and I've got a new bearing here as well as a new bevel gear to install. So before we go ahead and install the bearing, what we want to do is take a paper towel, spray a little bit of rubbing alcohol on it, and then we just want to wipe around inside here just to make sure we don't have any grease or oil or anything that's going to interfere with the Loctite actually curing inside here and helping to retain that bearing. So we just want to clean it out as best we can. We got a little bit of gunk out of there, but it was actually pretty clean. So once we've got that cleaned out, we want to go ahead and take the bearing, and we can also wipe carefully the outer edge of that just to get any grease off this outer race here. And that will also interfere with the Loctite curing if you have any oil on this outer race. So now that we got that cleaned up, we can pull out our Loctite 609, and here's where you want to be really careful. You do not want to get any of this inside the inner race of the bearing, or it will cure and your bearing will become very notchy and it's just not going to work out. So we want to just carefully apply just a thin layer to the outer race. You don't have to go and apply a ton, but you do want to get some on there and spread it out around the bearing, being careful not to touch the inner race of the bearing or inside the middle of the bearing with the Loctite or any Loctite in your fingers. So once we got a nice thin layer all the way around the bearing, we can go ahead and, again, avoiding touching or getting any Loctite on the inner race or in the shield, we go ahead and install the new bearing, and then we can use a paper towel here just to push it in all the way, and now that's fully seated. And once we've got that bearing seated in there, I'm going to go ahead and install my bevel gear. So I'm just going to get it started and get it through the first bearing, and to get it through the second bearing, I'm just going to push it against the table, and we're just going to push down on it until we feel it snap into place. And you can see now I have it fully seated and it's spinning nice and smoothly. So now we can just let this sit for a few minutes and let the Loctite set up, and then we'll go on to our next segment. Okay guys, so the next thing we're going to look at is installing the bearings into the side plates of the tail assembly. So nothing really crazy to pay attention to here, other than, again, you want to clean out the inside here with alcohol to make sure there's no oil or grease present from either, if you're running a nitro, you might have some oil in there just from normal operation, or if you had an electric and you've been oiling your tail shaft, some of it could have gotten in here, and we don't want anything to interfere with the Loctite bonding the outer race of these bearings to the inside of these side plates. So I'm going to go ahead and take a paper towel and just clean up the inside here, and then just like the previous step, we're going to put a layer of 609 Loctite around the outer race of this, being very careful to not get any on the bearing shield or the inner race here. And then we're going to install the bearing in each side, and then we're going to come back for the next step. Okay guys, so in this segment we're going to go over one little thing that I do different than what I see a lot of guys do when they assemble their pitch lever assembly here onto the right tail case half. So you only have this small 1.5 millimeter bolt that actually holds this whole assembly onto the tail case. And in the past, especially on the nitro machines, when you have vibrations, sometimes it can loosen up a little bit, and to help kind of alleviate that, I usually take a little bit of the retaining compound here and actually put it on this face right here before I install it into the tail case. And it's not really there so much to bond the pitch lever assembly to the tail case, as Loctite isn't really a glue, but it does kind of help support the assembly in there and support this bolt, and it helps keep the assembly a little bit tighter, I feel. It's just a little extra precautionary measure. I also like to take red Loctite and actually red this bolt in. So I know I didn't show that in the first segment that we did when we went over the tools, but I do actually use red Loctite on this particular bolt just to help give it a little more extra security as well. So following those two things, that's kept this pretty much tight on my machines for many hundreds of flights. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean this up with some alcohol and put it together, and we're going to move on to our next segment. Okay, so in this next segment I want to go over something that I've seen on some of the new Align tail pitch slider assemblies. Particularly those of you who are running a nitro model is typically where I've seen this. But occasionally, depending on how much Loctite they put in the bearings when they install these into the pitch lever assemblies, I've seen the bearings actually break loose, and then they can have some wiggle room in here and create slop in your tail assembly. Typically, the signs that this has happened will be you'll see a little bit of a black residue surrounding the bearing where it mounts here. And over time, it can develop and cause more and more slop in your tail assembly. So if you happen to notice this occurring to your tail, there's a very easy fix for it, which we're going to go over right now. So what you want to do is obviously isolate the particular component where you're noticing the bearings loosened up, and you want to remove the old bearings. I find a lot of the times when the bearings do this, the bearings themselves also typically are shot, since they're fairly small bearings, so I typically go ahead and put new bearings into the component that I'm working on as well. So once you have the old bearings out, what you want to do is just use some isopropyl rubbing alcohol and just spray a little in there and just clean out the assembly. Again, we want to make sure we have no oil or any residue in there to interfere with the bonding of the Loctite that we're going to put on it. So once we've got that all cleaned out and dried out, we want to go ahead and do the same thing to the bearings. Now, you want to be very careful with these bearings. They're so small, it's very easy to dribble alcohol on them when you're cleaning the outer race that is actually going to be in contact with the Loctite. So what I usually do is take a cotton swab, and let's move my towel here. I usually spray the cotton swab down, and then just very carefully I go along the outer race and clean off any of the oil that might be there from the factory. You kind of want to be careful not getting the alcohol inside the bearing, as it can dry out some of the stuff that, or some of the lubricant that's inside there. So once we get that cleaned off, just quickly there, we can go ahead and get ready to assemble it. So I'm going to use my 1.5 millimeter driver here as a applicator tool for the Loctite 609, because again, we do not want to get any of this inside the bearing when we're assembling it. So if we put a drop or so on the tip of the driver, we can go ahead and carefully place it on the race here You want to be very careful. It's very easy to get Loctite inside of the bearing, especially on these small ones when you're doing this. A toothpick might help as well. I get a lot away with the 1.5mm driver, but you just want to get a thin layer of Loctite all the way around the bearing. And once we have that, we want to go ahead and carefully install it into the component we're replacing it on, very carefully. And once you've got it seated, we can go ahead and just wipe off any of the Loctite that might have squeezed out. Try and be careful not to touch the inner race. Once you've got that installed there, you can go ahead and reassemble this on your helicopter and let the Loctite cure. And you should be good to go. Once I've done this, I have not had them typically break loose again. Okay guys, so I want to go over the aligned tail pitch slider assembly. One thing that I really want to emphasize here is that if you find your tail mechanics are a bit tight, when you're moving your linkages, you find the tail kind of binds or gets locked up at certain points, almost all of that can be tied back to the dog bone connection point to this yoke on the tail pitch slider assembly right here. What can happen is either these bolts right here get over compressed and put undue amount of squeeze on the dog bone, and that can cause it to bind up in here and be very tight, especially around the ends over here or inside on this side. And that can lead to binding in your mechanics when you have this all bolted together and assembled. So a lot of times when I see guys who have their tails too tight, the first thing I go to is this connection point right here. One thing to note is on the newer aligned tail assemblies, they have swapped over from having the dual brass spacer pieces, as I've got right here, on both ends of the dog bone. So on the newer assemblies, there is only one of these, and it goes on the side that connects to your tail grips. But on the side that connects to the pitch slider assembly, Align now uses a brass bolt. So that's a bit of a change, and as a result of that, what I found, if you find your dog bone fits too tightly into the yoke, is to take a file and just lightly file down either side of this dog bone. You want to take off a little bit of material at a time. You don't want to go too crazy. And you really want to emphasize the area just in front of my index finger here on this side of the dog bone. That's typically where I find it tends to lock up in the yoke. But you just want to kind of clean up either side a little bit at a time until when you have this assembled, the dog bone moves freely with no or minimal amount of up and down slop. And that will take care of most of the binding issues that you might have in your tail assembly. So that's just one thing to pay attention to when putting together your aligned tail pitch slider assembly. Okay guys, so in this segment I want to go over the aligned tail grip assembly. So if we start here with the tail hub, one thing to note is that it tends to come with a protective film of oil over the component. So this will interfere with any Loctite we may apply to the various threaded areas on the part here. And we want to use some isopropyl rubbing alcohol and just get all those areas cleaned up, especially in the set screw threads right here, as well as in the tail spindle bolt grip holes right here. And that will ensure our Loctite bonds correctly. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and pull out the thrust bearings from the tail grips right here. And I tend to find that out of the box in the factory there's just only a little bit of lubricant located inside these thrust bearing races. So I like to re-grease them with either a white lithium grease or a synthetic grease. And you just want to fill up the races on both sides and make sure you have a good coating on both sides of the race before we reassemble it into the blade grips. It's also important to note here that there's these two shims that go into the tail grip, and these space out the thrust bearing from the radial bearing that is inside the tail grip right here. So one thing to note is that you want to make sure you install this spacer before you put the thrust bearing into the tail blade grip. You don't want to forget that, or you will have problems in flight and you will destroy your bearings and have slop and all kinds of other non-fun issues. So we want to make sure we have the spacers installed. The other thing to pay attention to, especially if you're taking your assembly apart after many hundreds of flights, is to just check out the radial bearings and make sure they're good to go. I've got some new ones here I'm going to put into these grips because these grips are pretty old and have a lot of flights on them. But just want to pay attention to those and in general make sure your bearings are in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and grease the races of these two thrust bearings right here, and I'm going to reassemble both blade grips. And then using the technique we've used throughout the video, I'm going to Loctite the outer race of these radial bearings into the tail blade grips right here. And then we're going to use some blue Loctite to assemble the grips onto the hub and then install the hub onto the tail case assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll be back for our next segment. Okay guys, so in the last segment here, I just want to show you one other thing that I do when putting my tail assembly together. So similar to what we did with the tail pitch lever mount over here, I want to go ahead and apply a thin film of the Loctite 608 retainer compound on the actual pitch lever itself before we go ahead and mount it to the yoke piece over here. And again, this isn't here so much to bond the lever to the yoke as it is to just kind of support the bolt, since there is only one bolt actually holding this lever onto the yoke assembly here. And I found that just helps keep that bolt a little more tight. I've had it loosen up on the Nitro model with the extra vibration occasionally. So that kind of helps with that. And again, I tend to use a little bit stronger Loctite for the bolt that goes in here as well. And that basically concludes my tips and tricks here for the aligned tail case assembly. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at dcheckus1@gmail.com, and I'll be more than happy to help. So thank you again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.